They called it the Great War. But for the men in the mud it was something else entirely. No grand strategies. No honor or glory. Just cold, wet days, endless nights, and the unrelenting dread that tomorrow could be your last. This is the story not of generals or empires, but of the soldiers who lived, suffered and fought in the trenches of World War I. In 1914, the war moved faster than anyone expected. Armies marched with confidence. Cavalry units still charged into battle. Many believed it would be over by Christmas. They were wrong. After the initial German advance was stopped at the Battle of the Marne, both sides dug in. From the North Sea to the Swiss border, a twisting scar of earth began to form across Europe, the Western Front. It stretched over 400 miles. It barely moved for 4 years. It became a world of trenches. To understand trench warfare, you must first understand what a trench was, and what it became. At first, trenches were shallow, temporary ditches, meant to protect from gunfire. But as the war dragged on, they became more elaborate. Front-line trenches, where soldiers fought and died. Support trenches, behind the lines, holding reserves. Communication trenches, connecting them like veins in a battlefield. Each trench was fortified with sandbags, wooden planks, barbed wire, and duckboards to keep feet above the mud, when they could. The British, French, and Germans all had different trench styles. The Germans, expecting to hold ground, often built deeper, stronger, more permanent lines. Picture this: a young man, barely 18. His uniform still clean, rifle freshly issued. He's marched for hours through rain and shell-pocked fields. Now, under the cover of night, he enters the trench for the first time. The smell hits him first, a mix of mud, sweat, blood, and decay. Then the sound, distant explosions, whispers, shouts, the low buzz of lice. Then the mud, so thick it pulls at his boots, like it wants to swallow him whole. He won't sleep tonight. Maybe not for days. This is the front. There were no welcome signs. No speeches. Just a hard stare from a veteran who tells him, "Keep your head down and your rifle dry." Rain turned trenches into swamps. In some places, water rose above a man's knees. There were no dry clothes, no change of socks. This led to a condition known as trench foot, a rotting of the flesh, caused by cold, wet, and unsanitary conditions. In the worst cases, feet were amputated. In winter, frostbite was common. In summer, heat brought flies, fleas, and disease, some as big as cats. They feasted on corpses and spread disease. Soldiers sometimes fired their rifles at them just to cope. Every soldier had them. They caused constant itching, sleep deprivation, and a fever known as trench fever. In no man's land, bodies often lay unrecovered. In the trenches themselves, makeshift burials were dug along the walls. Death was never far. Contrary to popular belief, trench warfare wasn't constant fighting. Days could pass without a single bullet fired. But tension never eased. The daily rhythm looked like this. Stand to. Before dawn, soldiers stood ready to repel a surprise attack. Chores and repairs. Clean rifles. Fix sandbags. Drain water. Ration distribution. Hard biscuits. Canned meat, called bully beef tea, if lucky. Lice combings and foot inspections. Daily, to prevent disease. Night patrols and raids. Under cover of darkness, soldiers snuck into no man's land to cut wire or gather intel. But boredom could be as deadly as combat. The endless waiting chipped away at sanity. Time passed like molasses, slow, heavy, and suffocating. Each day was a coin flip between silence and hell. Even on quiet days, death was close. A sniper's bullet could end a life in an instant. Artillery, thunderous, indiscriminate, could destroy a trench in seconds. Gas attacks came suddenly. Chlorine, phosgene, or mustard gas rolling silently into the trenches. Gas masks offered limited protection. And then there was the whistle, that high, sharp sound that signaled an attack. It meant going over the top, into no man's land, where machine guns waited. Most never made it 10 yards. Long-term exposure to this environment shattered men's minds. The term shell shock emerged, an early understanding of what we now call PTSD. Soldiers who developed tremors, memory loss, panic attacks, or were rendered speechless were often misunderstood, even punished. Commanders accused them of cowardice. Some were executed. But slowly, the military and society began to realize the human mind has limits. It wasn't weakness. It was survival, because no one was built to endure what the trenches demanded. Yet even here, among mud, blood and death, humanity flickered. Letters from home were read aloud in groups. Soldiers sang, told jokes, even played football when they could. They shared food, memories and silence. The trenches were brutal, but they were also the only world many young men knew. And in that world, small moments of kindness meant everything. Between the trenches stretched a narrow wasteland of fear and silence, a place where time stopped, where life and death shared the same muddy ground. It was called No Man's Land, and for many, it was the last thing they ever saw. No Man's Land was the name given to the stretch of land between two opposing trenches, often only 50 to 100 yards wide, but it might as well have been a mile, littered with barbed wire, shell craters, broken equipment, and the unburied dead, constantly watched by snipers, machine guns, and artillery. Crossing it meant risking your life with every step. It wasn't just geography, it was a psychological battlefield, where even standing up could cost you everything. Every soldier who spent time in the trenches lived with the daily knowledge of what lay just beyond the parapet. The sound of a twig snapping in no man's land could trigger a firefight. A flash of movement might mean a raid. Even whispers could travel through the stillness, like shouts. Soldiers often reported hearing voices, hallucinating shapes in the fog, or feeling watched when no one was there. We watched the land between us, like it was haunted, and maybe it was. Haunted by the men who never made it back. Despite the danger, no man's land wasn't always silent. At night, both sides sent out patrols, small groups crawling through the mud to cut enemy barbed wire, gather intelligence, capture prisoners, lay or remove mines. These missions were terrifying. No lights, no landmarks, only whispers and hand signals. If spotted, soldiers had two choices: freeze and hope to vanish into the mud, or run and risk being shot. Raids were even more dangerous. These involved hand-to-hand combat in enemy trenches, using clubs, knives, and pistols. Some raids lasted minutes, others turned into full battles. In the dead of night, in the heart of no man's land, men met face to face with their enemies. There were no rules, only survival. No man's land was often eerily quiet, until it wasn't. Artillery barricades shattered the silence, shaking the ground like earthquakes. Flare guns lit up the sky, exposing everything. Machine guns barked from dugouts, sweeping the ground with bullets. And worst of all, the cries of the wounded. After failed attacks, the wounded lay in the mud, moaning for water, crying for their mothers, or whispering prayers. But going out to help them often meant suicide. For some soldiers, the hardest part wasn't the fighting, it was hearing their friends die just yards away, and being unable to reach them. One of the most haunting aspects of this strip of earth was the number of bodies it held. Soldiers who fell during attacks were often left where they died. Retrieval efforts were rare and dangerous. Over time, no man's land became a mass grave. In some sectors, corpses were so numerous, they became landmarks. The man with the red scarf, the officer by the tree stump, the boy slumped over the wire. Even when possible, collecting the dead was a grim task. Identification was difficult. Dog tags were sometimes missing. The smell was overwhelming. It wasn't just a land of the dead. It was a place where the living had to step over friends, where the past lay open for all to see. Gas attacks were a horrifying part of trench warfare, and no man's land was often the first to be covered. The wind had to be just right. If it shifted, the gas could blow back toward your own lines. Types of gas included chlorine, green, choking, deadly; phosgene, colorless and slow-acting; mustard gas, blistered skin, blinded eyes, and lingered for days. When a gas attack was suspected, soldiers scrambled for their masks. But masks were imperfect, especially in the early years. Sometimes, entire patrols in no man's land vanished without a sound, suffocated by an invisible killer. No man's land was already hell. Gas made it worse. It turned the air into a weapon, and breath itself into a gamble. But even here, something unexpected happened. Christmas Eve, 1914. Along parts of the front, the guns went quiet. British and German soldiers climbed out of their trenches. They met in no man's land. They shook hands, exchanged cigarettes, even played football. One German soldier wrote, "It was as if the war had stopped by magic." For a brief moment, humanity broke through the mud and blood, but commanders were furious. The truce ended quickly, and such moments became rare. For a few hours, no man's land wasn't a place of death. It was a space where enemies saw each other as men again. For veterans, the memory of no man's land never faded. It was where their friends died, where they faced their darkest fears, and where they left pieces of themselves they never got back. Even decades later, many could not speak of it without tears. It was a scar across Europe, but also a scar across the souls of those who fought. No man's land was more than a battlefield. It was a graveyard of youth, hope, and humanity. In the trenches of World War I, survival depended on more than courage. It required tools, some designed for war, others for endurance. A soldier's kit was his lifeline, his burden, and sometimes all he had. By 1915, every soldier on the front line carried a nearly identical load. Rifle and bayonet ammunition pouches, steel helmet, entrenching tool, a small shovel, mess kit, gas mask, basic medical supplies, a water bottle and rations, and perhaps most personally, a photo, a letter, or a Bible. This kit weighed 60 to 90 pounds, carried through mud, under fire, in rain and heat. Each item served a purpose. But some became symbolic of a soldier's fight to remain human in an inhuman war. The rifle was a soldier's closest companion. In most armies, it was a bolt-action weapon. British Lee Enfield, German Mauser, French Lebel, American Springfield. Firing a bullet took time. Load, aim, fire, reload. But in skilled hands, these rifles were deadly accurate. Each soldier was expected to clean his weapon daily, know how to repair jams, fire quickly and calmly under stress. In trench raids, the bayonet, a blade fixed to the end of the rifle, turned the weapon into a brutal spear. In close quarters, rifle butts, knives, and even fists were often more useful than bullets. You didn't hate your rifle, you needed it. It was the only thing between you and death. By 1915, poison gas was a terrifying part of the war. At first, soldiers had nothing to protect them. Some used urine-soaked cloths, hoping the chemicals would be neutralized. Later, armies issued gas masks with crude filters. Early models were awkward, hot, and hard to see through. Even with training, panic often set in. Soldiers scrambled to don masks within seconds of an alert. If you didn't seal it in time, even a breath could be lethal. Gas changed the rules of war. It meant that death could float invisibly through the air, and fear could seep into every breath. The iconic Brodie helmet, the flat steel design, worn by British and American troops, became a signature image of WWI. It protected from shrapnel, not bullets. It was heavy and uncomfortable, but it saved lives. French soldiers wore the Adrian helmet, while Germans used the Stahlhelm, a rounded, deeper helmet, offering better protection. Helmets often bore unit insignia, chalk markings, or personal etchings. They were as much psychological armor as physical. The helmet wasn't perfect, but it gave a man something to believe in, a thin shell between his thoughts and the chaos above. Not all enemies wore uniforms. Rats thrived in the trenches, feeding on rotting food and the dead. They grew enormous. Some soldiers swore they could hear them fighting at night. Lice were constant companions. No amount of washing or delousing stopped them. They lived in seams of uniforms, caused intense itching, spread trench fever, leaving men bedridden with high fevers and rashes. And then there was dysentery, a brutal stomach infection caused by filthy water, poor sanitation, and tainted food. Entire units suffered. The enemy wasn't always in front of you. Sometimes, it was crawling in your clothes, or festering in the soup. Every soldier carried an entrenching tool, a small shovel used for digging, defense, and sometimes even combat. In hand-to-hand fights, a sharpened spade was as deadly as a knife. Soldiers built fire steps, dugouts, and latrines using nothing but these tools.
Wire cutters were essential for clearing barbed wire ahead of attacks. Barbed wire was everywhere, twisted coils stacked waist-high, coated in blood and mud. Cutting it was dangerous. It often had to be done in the dark, in silence, under the eyes of the enemy. In this war, the shovel and the wire cutter were just as important as the rifle, because before you could fight, you had to survive. Food in the trenches was a constant struggle. Typical meals included hard-tack biscuits, so tough, soldiers broke teeth on them, bully beef, canned corned beef, bread soaked in water, occasional tea, or jam. Fresh food was rare, water was often tainted. Hunger became routine, but soldiers adapted. They made trench stews with whatever they could find. They traded and bartered with each other. They shared cigarettes, chocolate, and anything from home like gold. A spoonful of jam, a cup of hot tea. These became luxuries, moments where you could almost forget the war. Every soldier carried something personal, something that made them feel human. A letter from home, a photograph of a sweetheart, a locket, or cross, even a lucky coin, or childhood toy. These small tokens were carried into battle, soaked in mud, and stained with blood, but they were fiercely protected. When everything else was stripped away, these items reminded men who they were. Not just soldiers, but sons, brothers, fathers, human beings. The trenches of World War I were not built for life, but soldiers endured. Their tools, simple, worn, and often improvised, tell a deeper story, not just of war, but of willpower. A rifle to fight, a shovel to dig, a helmet to hope, and a photograph to remember. In the mud of the trenches, surrounded by death, these tools weren't just for war, they were for surviving it. In the trenches where death was always near, men leaned on the only constant they had, each other. What began as forced camaraderie became something sacred, a bond forged in fire, fear, and the fight to stay human. The harshness of trench life brought soldiers together in a way few civilians could understand. Shared misery, erased class, background, and even language barriers. They ate together, fought together, and often died together. These men called each other brother, mate, or simply pal. For many, the man beside them became their only anchor to sanity. We weren't fighting for kings or countries. We fought for the man to our left, and the one to our right. In Britain, the government encouraged friends and co-workers to enlist together. These units were called pals battalions. Men from the same town, school, or job would serve side by side. It built instant morale, but it had devastating consequences. When a single battalion was wiped out, entire communities back home lost their sons, brothers and neighbors in a single day. It seemed like a good idea, fight with your friends. But in war, it meant some towns lost an entire generation in a single battle. Despite the horror, soldiers found ways to laugh. They sang parody songs, told dirty jokes, and gave nicknames to everything, from rats to officers. Trench newspapers, handwritten or typed, offered sarcastic news of lice invasions and mudslides. Some units held mock trials for stolen rations, or wore ridiculous outfits on rest days. Humor became a weapon of defiance, a way to say, you can't take our souls, no matter what you throw at us. One of the few connections to home was mail. Soldiers waited anxiously for letters from mothers, wives, children. A single envelope could lift a man's spirits for days, or break his heart. They also wrote letters, often upbeat, downplaying the danger. A soldier might be surrounded by death, but in his letters, he'd write about the weather, or how the food wasn't too bad. It was a lie, but a necessary one. When soldiers received news from home, of births, deaths, or betrayals, it could unravel them. No matter how close men became, the pressure often shattered even the strongest. Shell shock, what we now call PTSD, was common and poorly understood. Symptoms included tremors, mutism, paranoia, hallucinations, loss of motor control. Some believed it was cowardice, others knew better. British soldiers quote, "He wasn't weak, he just ran out of room in his mind to hold all the horror." Doctors tried crude treatments, electric shocks, isolation, even punishment. Many soldiers never recovered. They called it losing your nerve. But those men didn't lose anything. They gave everything their mind could offer. until there was nothing left. Some soldiers couldn't bear it any longer. They walked into no man's land, unarmed. They stopped talking or eating. Some took their own lives. These weren't acts of weakness. They were acts of despair. In many cases, suicide wasn't reported. Families were told their loved one died in battle. It was seen as kinder. The war didn't just kill men with bullets. It killed them slowly, with memories they couldn't forget, and pain they couldn't name. But even in the darkest moments, humanity endured. Soldiers shared blankets with freezing comrades. They carried wounded friends through gunfire. They celebrated birthdays with scraps of chocolate. Some even risked their lives to drag the enemy wounded to safety. These weren't rare miracles. They were everyday acts. In a place designed to break men, many chose compassion instead. That's how they stayed human. That's how they reminded each other, we are still alive. When a comrade died, it hit like a cannon blast to the heart. Sometimes there was no time to grieve. Sometimes they buried the fallen right beside the trench. Helmets became gravestones. Rifle butts marked graves. They often held small services, shared a prayer, sang a song, or poured out a ration of rum in tribute. And then, they had to move on. Soldiers quote, tearfully, I buried my best friend in the same mud we cursed together the day before. Then I picked up my rifle, and went back to the line. The trenches were not just places of death and despair. They were places of connection. Bonds formed there lasted lifetimes. Veterans spoke of comrades with a reverence no outsider could match. Many never found friendships like those again. The war took much, but it gave them each other. In the cold, the mud, the fear, there was brotherhood. And in that brotherhood, there was light. In the final years of the Great War, the trenches were no longer just defensive lines. They became launching points for assaults that promised to end the war, yet only deepened its wounds. This was the final push, where bravery met madness. Going over the top meant climbing out of your trench and running headlong toward the enemy. It was the most terrifying moment for any soldier. Soldiers carried rifles, grenades, and sometimes just clubs. They often marched in lines, shoulder to shoulder. Artillery would pound enemy lines beforehand, called a barrage, but rarely destroyed enough. Most men knew, once you climbed out, your life was no longer yours. To charge was to step into chaos. You didn't know if the man beside you would make it 5 feet, let alone 5 yards. On July 1st, 1916, the British launched one of the largest offensives of the war, the Battle of the Somme. Over 100,000 British soldiers attacked. Nearly 60,000 became casualties on the first day. Entire battalions were erased within minutes. Machine guns mowed down wave after wave of young men. The artillery had failed to break the enemy wire. It was a massacre. Soldiers quote, haunted, I saw boys from my school, lying where they fell. Faces I knew, gone in an instant. We kept running. What else could we do? Despite the horror, acts of bravery were everywhere. Men threw themselves on barbed wire, so others could pass. Officers led from the front, knowing it meant almost certain death. Wounded soldiers crawled forward, dragging grenades or messages. Victoria Crosses, Croix de Guerre, and other medals were awarded, often posthumously. But most bravery was never seen by command. It happened in the dirt, under fire, seen only by friends who lived to remember. Courage wasn't a grand moment. It was the decision to keep moving forward, when everything inside screamed to stop. In 1917, the Allies launched an attack near the Belgian village of Passchendaele. What followed was one of the most miserable campaigns in modern history. Constant rain turned the battlefield into a swamp. Men drowned in mud, unable to escape shell craters. Horses and supply carts vanished into the muck. Over 400,000 casualties. For 5 miles of land, they fought for inches, for ground that wasn't worth the lives it cost. But still they pushed, because someone said to. By 1918, the Allies were stronger, better supplied, and more organized. The American Expeditionary Force had arrived, fresh and eager. New tactics, combined arms, tanks and creeping barrages, began to break the stalemate. German forces, stretched thin and low on morale, began to retreat. This final series of attacks, called the 100 Days Offensive, would push the Central Powers back, and eventually force an armistice. But even as victory approached, the dying did not stop. Every step forward was paid for in blood. The closer they came to peace, the harder the war seemed to resist ending. WWI was a breeding ground for military innovation. Among the most terrifying to the enemy, and exhilarating to the Allies, was the tank. Clumsy and slow at first, tanks improved rapidly. They could crush barbed wire, and roll over trenches. Their psychological impact was enormous. Airplanes, once used just for scouting, now dropped bombs and fired machine guns. Flamethrowers appeared, turning trench clearing into a nightmare. And yet for many soldiers, nothing felt new. The weapons changed, the uniforms changed, but the suffering remained exactly the same. As the war dragged on, the psychological toll deepened. More men were diagnosed with shell shock. Many refused to go over the top, not out of cowardice, but from exhaustion. Some simply walked away, choosing prison or death over another charge. By late 1918, some units were held together by discipline alone, and even that began to crack. Commanding officers report, "They are good boys, but they are broken. I don't know how much more I can ask of them." In the last days of the war, heroism burned brightest. Henry Tanday, a British soldier, reportedly spared a wounded German, rumored to be Adolf Hitler. American troops at Argonne Forest broke German lines in one of the war's final major offensives. Nurses, stretcher-bearers, and medics braved the battlefield without weapons, saving lives under fire. These final weeks felt like a sprint through fire. They sensed the war was ending, but no one wanted to be the last to die. At 11 a.m. on November 11th, the war ended. But not before commanders insisted on final offensives. On the morning of the armistice, over 2,700 men were killed on the war's last day. For some, peace came one breath too late. Their families received letters announcing both their death and the end of the war. The final push of World War I wasn't about victory parades or grand triumphs. It was about men digging deeper into courage they didn't know they had, fighting not for glory, but for each other, enduring the unendurable. In the final push, they gave all they had left. And when the guns fell silent, only the circuit, on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the guns finally fell silent. For the first time in 4 years, the world stopped holding its breath. But peace, like war, comes at a price. Survivors remain to carry the stories. The armistice of November 11th, 1918, ended the fighting, but not the pain. Soldiers cheered, cried, and stood in disbelief. Some felt relief, others felt nothing. They were numb. Many couldn't process it. After years in the trenches, peace didn't feel real. When the war ended, men didn't rejoice as much as they exhaled. The nightmare was over, but the memories stayed. For most soldiers, returning home was not a hero's parade. It was a confusing, lonely journey. Demobilization took months, even years. Men returned to find jobs gone, loved ones changed, and cities unfamiliar. Many struggled with nightmares, flashbacks, and a world that could never understand what they'd seen. British veterans quote, "I stepped off the train. People smiled, but I didn't feel anything. I was still there, in the mud." The war had shattered bodies, but it had also broken minds. Thousands of soldiers suffered from shell shock, now recognized as PTSD. They shook uncontrollably, couldn't speak, or collapsed under stress. Hospitals were overcrowded. Treatments ranged from therapy to cruel electric shocks. Many families didn't understand. Some veterans hid their trauma, others were abandoned or institutionalized. They brought their ghosts home with them. And for many the war never truly ended. An entire generation of young men had vanished. 20 million dead, 21 million wounded. Some villages in France and Britain lost every young man of fighting age. Families grieved for sons who never returned, or who returned as strangers. The war also shattered illusions. Faith in governments, monarchies, and even God was shaken. Art, music, and literature reflected the disillusionment of a world scarred by horror. The war left behind more than graves. It left a silence in homes, a shadow in the eyes of survivors. Across France and Belgium, fields became cemeteries. White crosses stretched across green hills, millions of them. Many graves bore only the words, "A soldier of the Great War, known unto God." The dead were honored, but also used in political narratives. The war was called the war to end all wars, but its lessons were quickly forgotten. They promised it would never happen again. And yet, it would, and a crack in the soul of Europe. In every country, people built memorials.
The Menin Gate in Ypres lists the names of 54,000 soldiers with no known grave. The cenotaph in London became a focal point of grief. Veterans gathered on November 11th each year to remember fallen comrades. In Germany, France, Britain, and beyond, remembrance became ritual, but grief was not uniform. Some remembered with sorrow, others with anger, guilt, or bitterness. Many soldiers kept in touch with trench mates for life. They visited graves together. They drank in silence, toasted the lost, and told stories only fellow soldiers could understand. For some, that brotherhood was the only thread holding them to the world. Veterans quote, "I don't remember the dates. I remember the faces, the voices. The man who handed me his last cigarette before he died." The trenches themselves became symbols of sacrifice, bravery, and endurance, but also of futility, mud, and madness. Writers like Eric Maria Remarque, "All quiet on the Western Front," and Wilfred Owen gave voice to the silent suffering. And future generations studied those trenches, not just for military history, but to understand the depths of human endurance, and the consequences of pride, power, and miscalculation. What the men endured in the trenches defied comprehension. Cold that broke their bodies, noise that shattered their minds, loss that carved into their hearts. Yet somehow, they held on to fragments of kindness, a shared meal, a joke in the dark, a hand on the shoulder before the next assault. In the worst place on earth, they found the best in each other. And that is what makes them unforgettable. We remember them not only for their courage, but for their humanity. They were sons and brothers, farmers and teachers, poets and laborers, and they showed the world that even in the face of horror, the human spirit could endure.